3 county vehicles stopped at Evelyn Brooks's locked farm gate,
We need your crossing.
while both public roads disappeared beneath floodwater.
Can it carry them?
Her private steel crossing was the only route left, but the largest rescue truck exceeded the limit she and Layla had measured.
That truck is over the limit.
Opening the gate could save 9 households.
That truck does not cross. Use those smaller pickups instead.
Or destroy their last way out.
One light vehicle at a time.
Before anyone crossed, Evelyn had to choose which risk she could defend.
Keep moving. Do not stop. Stop the crossings!
Evelyn Brooks kept one hand on the padlock while 3 county vehicles idled outside her gate. Behind them, the public road vanished into brown floodwater. Ahead, her private steel crossing was the only route still connected to the farms east of Harrow Creek. Andrew Mercer wanted the gate opened. Evelyn needed to know whether the bridge beneath her daughter's boots could survive what came next. "Can it carry them?" Layla asked. Evelyn opened her covered notebook and checked the vehicle weights Andrew had written on the last page. Rain dotted the color-coded columns. Lila flexed one hand inside her grandfather's oversized work gloves. The right glove had come loose. Evelyn tightened its wrist strap, then looked at the waiting vehicles. "It can carry what we measured," she said, "not what people hope it can carry." Every other farm had lost road access. Now the county depended on 12 rusted beams it had sold without a certified load rating, and on the woman who had accepted responsibility for them. 5 months earlier, those beams lay behind a chain fence at the Carroll County Equipment Yard labeled Lot 47. 12 steel beams, salvage only. Most bidders stayed in the aisle. Evelyn stepped close and pressed a scraper against the brown scale along the lower flange. A sheet of corrosion broke away. Dark steel showed beneath it. Andrew watched from the fence. "The card says no inspection certificate." "I can read the card, then read the line under it. No certified load rating, no structural warranty. Buyer assumes all testing and reuse risk." Evelyn studied the beam ends. Corrosion was heavier there, but the long center sections appeared straight. That did not make them safe. It made them worth testing. When were they removed? 5 years ago. Old Mill Road Bridge replacement. Structural failure? Replacement grant. The records are incomplete. Andrew lowered his voice. "I know you inspected structural steel, Evelyn. You haven't done it professionally in 9 years. Steel didn't change while I was growing soybeans. Liability did." That nearly made her smile. Lila stood nearby with the auction booklet against her chest. She had been accepted into a civil engineering program 2 counties north. Lately, every farm repair felt like a decision about a future she had not chosen. Evelyn walked the lot without making promises. Rust might cover usable steel or damage no eye could find. If she bought the beams, testing, not confidence, would decide what they were worth. The auctioneer called for bids. Evelyn raised her number. A salvage dealer answered. She raised it again. Lila moved beside her. "That's the barn roof money. I know. And the Northfield drainage. I know that too." The dealer bid once more. Evelyn lifted her card. Layla looked at the beams. "You keep spending like there'll always be 2 of us here." Evelyn had no quick answer. The auctioneer waited, then dropped his hand. Lot 47 sold. With the hauling deposit, Evelyn's bid would empty nearly all the reserve she had saved. She signed the receipt anyway. Andrew placed the liability form beside it. If those beams fail testing, the county does not buy them back. If you reuse them, the county does not approve your design. If anything happens, it belongs to me, Evelyn said. He offered the pen, all 12, rust, missing records and responsibility. Evelyn signed beneath the warning, then looked through the fence at steel she could not yet prove was useful. "All 12, she said. The beams arrived on 2 flatbed trailers and left orange stains across the gravel yard. Evelyn did not call them bridge steel, not yet. She marked inspection windows on the first beam and knocked away the loose scale. Beneath the rust, the flange was straight, and the steel rang clean beneath her hammer. Layla watched from the barn doorway. "So you were right?" "I was right about this patch. That is not what I asked. It is the only answer this patch can give." The licensed structural engineer Evelyn hired arrived the next morning with an ultrasonic tester, a thickness gauge, and one condition. Every beam had to be tested. A clean surface could still hide damage no hammer strike could reveal. Evelyn read the estimate twice. "We can inspect the best 8 first," she said. "If those pass, all 12, the engineer replied. "Or I do not seal a design using any of them." Evelyn glanced at the barn roof she had promised to repair before summer storms. Then she signed. Layla labeled the beams A through L because her mother's system, North Stack, Lower Pair, Creek Side, made sense only to Evelyn. For 3 days, the work gave them a temporary peace. Evelyn cleaned inspection areas, the engineer took readings, and Lila recorded the results. 9 beams passed the first round. 2 needed their damaged ends removed but retained enough usable length for the original design. Then Lila found the paid invoice beneath the seat of Evelyn's truck. She carried it into the yard. Hauling, testing, and an engineering retainer? Evelyn kept brushing beam K. That is what the invoice says. With what money? The grain payment came early. The payment for operating through winter? I moved some things. Layla's voice stayed quiet. You moved everything. Evelyn set down the brush. The county crossing floods twice a year. If an ambulance cannot reach us, winter grain does not matter. This is not only about an ambulance. Lila held the invoice between them. You are building one more reason I am supposed to stay. Evelyn wanted to deny it. Instead, she picked up the brush again, which was answer enough. The engineer called them over to beam L. Its first readings looked ordinary. Then the signal split near the lower flange, 12 feet from one end. He repeated the scan from the opposite side. The same dark band returned. Surface corrosion? Evelyn asked. He shook his head. Internal. Possibly an old lamination opened by moisture. We need to map it. They cleaned a wider section and tested along a chalk grid. The defect continued farther than Evelyn expected. Beam L could not serve as a continuous main span. Layla looked at her mother, waiting for the explanation that usually followed bad news. None came. Andrew's warning had not been cowardice. Rust had concealed usable steel on 11 beams. On the 12th, it had concealed uncertainty that experience alone could not dismiss. The engineer unfolded the site plan across the hood of Evelyn's truck. Without beam L, the original clear span design finished. There is a narrower section upstream, he said. We can remove the defective length, reuse the sound sections, and shorten the crossing. But you will need new grading, deeper footings, and more concrete. How much more? Layla asked. He wrote a figure in the margin. The shorter bridge would cost more than the longer one, and its approach would cut through land Evelyn planned to sow. Layla placed the invoice beside the estimate. Tell me this is still a plan, not a promise you cannot afford. For the first time since raising her auction card, Evelyn had no answer. By sunrise pieces, the engineer had moved the proposed crossing 140 feet upstream. The creek was narrower there, but the western bank sat higher and farther from the county road. We shorten the span, he said, marking the revised plan, and lengthen both approaches. Evelyn studied the numbers. More excavation, more concrete, less land available for soybeans. Lila pointed to beam L, and that one? The defective section comes out, the engineer said. The sound steel can become cross-bracing. It will not carry the main span. Evelyn nodded. Every purchased beam could still serve a purpose, but only if she stopped asking damaged steel to do a job it could no longer do. Work began the following week. A fabricator removed the corroded ends from the 11 usable beams, then paired their strongest sections over the shorter channel. Beam L was cut into smaller pieces for secondary bracing and guard supports. Evelyn measured every cut before welding began. Lila created a spreadsheet because she could no longer tolerate her mother's notes. "You wrote good enough near cottonwood in an inspection book," she said. "There is only one cottonwood. That does not make it a measurement." For a moment, Evelyn laughed. Layla did too, and the sound made the construction yard feel less like a boundary between them. They placed the concrete abutments above the highest flood level recorded on Evelyn's property. Layla transferred each measurement into a color-coded load log: beam thickness, weld locations, concrete curts, approach slope, and estimated vehicle limits. Evelyn never asked her to do it. That made the help easier to accept. 3 weeks later, Layla found blue tarps stretched across the leaking section of the barn roof. The roofing crew had been scheduled for that morning. She walked to the creek where Evelyn was checking anchor bolts. "You canceled them." Evelyn kept her eyes on the wrench. "Postponed. Until when?" "After harvest." "The contractor said you moved the deposit to the bridge account." Evelyn tightened the bolt until the wrench clicked. She had promised not to hide another cost, then hidden it beneath a tarp where rain would eventually expose it. "The concrete ran over budget," she said. "So you decided alone again." "I decided the crossing had to be finished." "That is what you say whenever the farm wants something from both of us." Evelyn stood. "The farm has never asked you for anything." "No. You ask for it." Lila turned toward the unfinished deck. "I have a move-in date now," she said. "August 22nd. Evelyn knew about the acceptance letter, but a date made leaving physical. It placed a final morning on the calendar. She looked toward the barn roof, then at the bridge, consuming the money meant to repair it. "You should go." Layla's expression hardened, as though she had expected resistance and did not trust its absence. "I mean it," Evelyn continued. "You do not owe this farm your degree. You do not owe me your life because I spent mine here. And if the roof falls in, I will repair it. With what, I don't know yet." It was not a comforting answer, but it was the first one Evelyn gave, without disguising fear as certainty. The deck was completed in late spring. During the final inspection, weighted farm trucks crossed one at a time while gauges measured movement beneath the steel. The structure remained within the engineer's approved limits. Lila stood beside the approach with her load log. She painted pairs of narrow reference marks along the deck: blue for vehicle spacing, yellow for inspection points, and red beneath the western edge to show changes in water height. Evelyn watched her finish the last blue line. "You made that one wider," she said. "Drivers drift when they are nervous. You accounting for human behavior now. Someone has to." The engineer signed the private inspection report. The crossing was approved for farm vehicles and light emergency access under strict weight and spacing limits. It was not a public bridge, and it was not indestructible. It was simply documented, tested, and usable. Evelyn handed the report to Lila. "You should keep a copy." Lila closed the folder without taking it. "Keep it with the farm records." She washed the paint from her hands, packed her laptop into the truck, and left for her college orientation. The bridge had passed every test placed upon it. The promise between mother and daughter had not. The first flood warning arrived 17 days before Layla's college move-in date. Caro County expected heavy rain, but not enough to close both public crossings. Andrew's office advised farmers to move equipment from low ground and avoid unnecessary travel. Evelyn read the notice twice, then carried her rain gauge to the creek. By evening, water had reached the lowest red mark beneath the western edge of her bridge. Lila crouched beside the deck with the load log sealed into plastic sleeve. 4 inches since noon, she said. 4 3/8. You corrected me during a flood. It is still water when measured accurately. Lila recorded the number, fighting a small smile. Evelyn photographed the gauge and sent the reading to Andrew. They had disagreed over nearly every stage of the crossing, but that did not make the measurement less useful. His reply came 10 minutes later. Old Mill Road remains open. South Fork approach stable. Continue sending readings. Before dark, Evelyn moved the tractor, fuel cans, and portable welder into the equipment shed. Layla carried boxes from the lower storage room, while rain struck the metal roof above the tarps. "You should drive to Aunt Rochelle's tonight," Evelyn said. "And leave you here? You have orientation paperwork to finish. I brought it. This could get worse. That is why I brought it." Evelyn did not argue again. At Old Mill Road, tree limbs and fence wire had begun collecting against a drainage opening upstream from the public crossing. The county had postponed clearing that ditch in spring, while its only excavator repaired a failed culvert near the school. The decision had been reasonable then. Under rising water, it became pressure against a road, never designed to hold it. Andrew arrived before the water covered the warning posts. 2 pickup trucks waited behind him, their drivers insisting they could cross before the road closed. He walked into the lane and raised both hands. "Turn around." One driver pointed toward the shallow water. "I crossed deeper than that last year." "Then you were lucky last year." Andrew locked the barrier before either driver could test him. 20 minutes later, debris shifted across the drainage opening and muddy water spread over both lanes. He called Evelyn from his truck. "Old Mill is closed. What is the rise rate?" "About 2 inches every 15 minutes. Mine is faster." A pause followed. In the past, Andrew might have asked whether her gauge was calibrated. This time, he asked for the latest photograph. Evelyn sent it. The second red mark disappeared beneath the current. Shortly after midnight, water still flowed below the steel, but branches were striking the western bank at a changing angle. Inside the equipment shed, runoff crept beneath the door. Layla looked toward the welder. "We can move everything to the barn." Evelyn watched a cluster of limbs rotate near the abutment. "No. Bring the notebook and the inspection light. That equipment is not insured for flood damage. Neither is the bridge if we stop watching it." They left the boxes where they were. Under the deck, Evelyn checked the anchor plates while Layla recorded the water level and time. Rain ran from their sleeves. The crossing remained stable, but the current was no longer moving evenly through the channel. At 1:36 a.m., Andrew called again. The gravel approach to South Fork had begun washing away. Runoff from an overflowing field ditch had cut behind the roadbed, leaving the pavement intact over an empty section of ground. A deputy discovered it before an ambulance attempted the crossing. The county closed the road. Layla stared at the map inside the load log. Old Mill was blocked. South Fork had lost its approach. Every farm east of Harrow Creek was now isolated from the highway, except Brooks Field. A dispatcher called Evelyn less than 2 minutes later. "Emergency access through your property," the woman said. "Public Works and rescue vehicles are heading to your gate." "What vehicles?" "Mrs. Brooks, people are cut off. I understand. I need axle weights, vehicle lengths, and the order they intend to cross." There was a brief silence. The dispatcher began reading from her screen. Layla opened the color-coded log and turned to the spacing chart she had designed months earlier. Evelyn removed the gate key from her pocket but did not yet put it into the lock. Headlights appeared beyond the rain. The county had reached her gate. Whether its vehicles could cross was now her responsibility. 5 months of testing and arguments now lay between Evelyn Brooks and the 12 beams beneath the flood. She turned the key, but kept the gate chained while Andrew Mercer stepped from the lead county pickup with an emergency access request. Behind him waited 2 light pickups and a high-clearance rescue truck. Lila read the dispatch sheet. "That last truck is 24,800 pounds. Andrew nodded. It gives us the fastest evacuation. It does not cross, Evelyn said. We have 9 households east of the creek. One includes a man who cannot walk without help. Then we reach him with something lighter. The road behind us may be gone by morning. If that truck damages this bridge, the road is gone tonight. Andrew glanced at the rising water. This is an emergency access request. It is not a new load rating. Opening the gate meant accepting risk without a signed easement, a maintenance agreement, or any promise that the county would cover damage to her land. Evelyn removed the chain anyway. The heavy truck stays here. Unload the medical gear. 2 pickups can relay people from the farms. 1 vehicle on the bridge at a time, under 10,000 pounds. No trailer and no stopping on the deck. Andrew checked her inspection report, then the creek. All right. A rescue supervisor reached for Layla's plastic-covered notebook. I'll handle traffic control. Lila held it against her jacket. Blue marks control spacing. Yellow marks locate inspection points. We do this for a living, so did my mother. The supervisor turned to Andrew. She keeps the log, Andrew said. Follow it. Layla took position at the western end. A vehicle could enter only after the previous one cleared the far blue pair. She recorded its weight, crossing time, occupants, and the water level at the red mark. The first pickup carried rescue workers east. Evelyn watched the joint between gravel and concrete as its tires moved across the deck. The steel held within its documented limits. 8 minutes later, headlights returned through the trees. An older couple and their son sat inside. A folded wheelchair was strapped in the bed, and the woman in front held a bag of medication. The driver slowed at the first blue marks. Keep moving, Layla called. Straight ahead. The pickup reached the center span. A branch struck the bank below, and the driver touched the brake. Do not stop! The wheelchair shifted against its straps. Evelyn stepped toward the deck, then stopped. Following the truck would add weight without solving anything. The driver released the brake. The pickup crossed the final mark and reached solid ground. The woman lowered her window. Are the bells still back there? Next route, Andrew said. We are going back. Only then did Evelyn breathe out. The relay was slower than Andrew wanted, but it worked. Rescue workers moved medical cases into the second pickup while Lila entered the crossing in her log. For once, the county was trusting limits she could prove. Then Layla looked upstream. A mass of fence wire, broken limbs, and part of a wooden shed broke free from the flooded bend. It struck a gravel bar, rotated, and lodged diagonally across the channel. The main current shifted toward the western bank. Mom, Evelyn was already moving. She descended beside the abutment and aimed her inspection light across the waterline. The soil had been firm 20 minutes earlier. Now the current curled backward against it, carrying away thin brown ribbons with every surge. Lila checked the red marks. It rose less than an inch. It does not have to rise. A clump of soil dropped from beneath the approach and vanished into the current. Behind them, the second pickup waited to carry the next family across. Ahead of them, 8 households still had no other road out. Evelyn looked from the vehicle to the hollow, forming beside the western abutment. The crossing was open. The ground holding it in place had started to leave. Evelyn raised one arm. Stop the crossings. The waiting pickup shut off its engine. Across the creek, rescue workers stood with the remaining families while the current continued cutting beneath the western approach. Andrew joined Evelyn at the abutment. The scour pocket had widened beyond the inspection light's beam. Water curled into it, removed another layer of soil, then carried the evidence downstream. We can place rock against it, Andrew said. Not while the current is hitting from that angle. The rock will follow the soil. Then what holds the approach? Evelyn looked past him toward her western soybean field. 11 acres of nearly mature plants stretched between the creek and a drainage ditch below the county road. During construction, the engineer had marked that low ground as a possible emergency overflow route. Evelyn had kept it on the plan because removing one line cost nothing. Using it would cost almost everything. She opened the waterproof folder and showed Andrew the contour map. We cut through the field berm here and deepen the old swale to the lower ditch. It gives part of the water somewhere else to go. Andrew traced the route with one finger. Through your crop, through 11 acres. And if the diversion does not reduce the pressure, then I lose the field and the bridge. That is not much of a choice. It is the one we have. Andrew called for the county excavator working near Old Mill Road. It could reach the western field without crossing Evelyn's bridge. Until then, the evacuation remained halted. Lila heard the equipment request over the radio. She studied the map, then looked beyond the gate. "That is the best section," she said. "I know. The grain contract depends on those acres. I know that, too. They had spent months protecting the crop that was supposed to replace the money used on the crossing. Now saving the crossing meant destroying the crop." Layla closed the load log. "What if we wait for the debris to shift?" Evelyn watched another piece of the approach collapse. "The creek is not waiting." The excavator arrived on the county side 15 minutes later. Andrew directed its operator toward the field, but Evelyn stopped him before the bucket touched the ground. "Not straight across. Follow the flag contour. If you cut too deep near the bridge, the new current may take the approach from behind." Andrew handed her the radio. "You direct it." The first bucket tore through the soybean rows. Green plants folded beneath the tracks. Dark soil rolled aside as the operator opened the old swale one section at a time. At the field berm, the bucket paused above the final strip, holding back the creek. Andrew looked at Evelyn. "Once he opens that, we do not close it tonight." Evelyn took the radio. "Break the berm." The bucket dropped. Water entered as a narrow brown stream, then widened through the cut. It ran between the flattened rows and spread across the field, bending thousands of plants in the same direction. Within minutes, 11 acres that had stood ready for harvest became a moving sheet of muddy water. Layla stared at the crop. "I can delay school." Evelyn kept watching the abutment. "No, Mom, this changes the winter numbers. It changes mine. I could work until spring and you helped because people needed a road tonight." Evelyn turned toward her. "Do not make that a debt you repay with your future." The words did not repair everything between them, but Lila reopened the load log. "Then help me check the western reference point." They measured together. The water level had fallen only half an inch, but its angle against the abutment was changing. The backward curl weakened. Soil still moved from the scour pocket, then slowed. Evelyn waited through 3 more readings before allowing the relay to resume. "One vehicle," she told Andrew. "Then we inspect again." The pickup crossed under Lila's spacing rules. Blue mark, clear deck, next vehicle. No one rushed, even when the radio reported that the Bell's porch had begun taking water. Each crossing carried another household toward the highway. After every vehicle, Evelyn checked the approach, while Lila recorded the time, weight, water level, and visible movement. The western reference point remained steady. Near dawn, the final pickup appeared through the trees. Mr. and Mrs. Bell sat in the back seat with wet blankets around their shoulders. A rescue worker held their frightened dog between his boots. The driver reached the first blue marks. "Straight through," Lila called. The truck moved onto the deck. Evelyn watched the damaged approach, not the steel. The tires passed the yellow inspection points, crossed the center span, and reached the final blue line. The pickup rolled onto solid ground. "No more vehicles," Evelyn said. Andrew closed the crossing behind it. Minutes later, the rain weakened enough to hear individual drops striking the steel. The diverted water continued, moving through the soybean field, but the current beside the abutment no longer deepened the scour pocket. Every isolated resident had crossed. The bridge remained standing. Evelyn and Layla walked to the edge of the flooded field. Rows that had been green the previous evening lay beneath brown water. Harvest income, winter repairs, and months of work had disappeared under one decision. Evelyn's glove strap hung loose at her wrist. Lala pulled it tight, just as her mother had done for her at the gate. Neither of them called the night a victory. They simply stood beside the 11 ruined acres and watched the only road left hold. 3 days after the rain stopped, the soybean field still looked like part of the creek. Mud covered the lower rows. Gravel from the western approach lay scattered across the grass, and a damp stain had spread across the barn ceiling where the tarps failed. The crossing survived, but survival had not restored what Evelyn spent to build it, or what she sacrificed to keep it open. Andrew arrived carrying the county's inspection report. The steel stayed within its documented limits, he said. The west approach needs rebuilding, and the scour protection has to be redesigned. Evelyn turned to the final page. What does the county intend to pay for? Andrew placed a second folder on her table. The county wanted permanent emergency access through Brooks Field. Evelyn read the proposed easement once, then pushed it back. This gives you access. It gives me liability. We can revise the language. You will fund inspections, approach maintenance, and repairs caused by county vehicles. You will restore any land damage during emergency use. No unrestricted public traffic, and no vehicle crosses above the certified limit. The board may not accept all of that. Then they need another road. Andrew did not argue. He collected the folder and left. 2 days later, he returned with an amended agreement. It included county-funded annual inspections, liability coverage, gate restoration, approach maintenance, and compensation for damage caused during declared emergencies. The agreement did not turn Evelyn's private crossing into free public infrastructure. It made cooperation a shared responsibility. The county also approved a public flood gauge upstream, a printed evacuation map for every household in the basin, and designed funding for a replacement high water route. Andrew did not announce the changes at a ceremony. He simply marked the projects funded at the next Public Works meeting. By August 22nd, the bridge approach had been rebuilt. The flooded acres would produce nothing that season, and Evelyn had to restructure the farm loan. The barn roof was repaired in sections instead of all at once. Layla packed her clothes, drafting tools, and grandfather's oversized gloves into the truck. At the bridge, Evelyn handed her a copy of the load log. "You might need an example of what not to do," she said. Layla opened it. Her color-coded columns filled every page. Buying uncertified steel? Hiding the concrete overrun. That too. Layla placed the log beside her engineering books. "I don't know if I'll come back to run the farm." Evelyn looked at the repaired approach. Months earlier, that answer would have sounded like rejection. Now she nodded. "You do not have to promise me a life you haven't lived yet." Layla hesitated. "I'll still come home. That is enough." Her truck crossed between the blue spacings marks and disappeared toward the highway. 4 months later, after the first cold rain of winter, Evelyn heard tires on the bridge. Lila's truck stopped beside the new public flood gauge. She stepped out, wearing her college jacket, checked the water level, and entered the number into her phone before driving toward the farmhouse. Evelyn waited on the porch. Layla climbed from the truck, and neither of them mentioned who might own the farm one day. There was time for that question later. A home did not prove its strength by keeping someone inside. It proved its strength by letting them leave without closing the way back. Would you sacrifice your own harvest to keep an entire community connected? Subscribe to Hush Stories for more original dramas about dignity, difficult choices, and the people worth finding a way home to.